Before dawn in March of 1997, a police captain was patrolling the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina when, up ahead, he saw there was this Jeep parked on the shoulder of the highway with its headlights on. Now, the vehicle was suspicious enough that the captain pulled over and he walked up to the Jeep. And as he got closer to it, he heard the engine running and he saw the driver's side window was down, but when he walked around to that side of the car, he saw nobody was inside. However, as he was standing there, a cell phone on the passenger seat began to ring. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go on vacation with the like button and all your friends, be sure to take lots of pictures. But when you post those pictures on social media, be sure you Photoshop out the like button. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving. Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang. And it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up, and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their 2-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, "Okay, well, where's my wife?" And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, "There's nobody here." Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it, but when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, "I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home." And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night. And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen. So Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working." Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, but Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway. And the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended. And so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered. And despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke, around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it had seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from two men who were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in this spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, but Hulk had a job to do. And so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you? You're insinuating that I hurt my wife? I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. Because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared. And as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught, but he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, and it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt three-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Medlin. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop, they leapt out of the car, and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands are still cuffed behind her, and without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight, and they smashed it into Kim's head, and then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin, after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today we have 2 stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the west coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he had heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So suddenly, with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy. And Francesco's resort actually did them all the time. So this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." And she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, An American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian. But then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands. He shoved his way through the crowd to the railing. Over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited, because finally he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous, because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain. And when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.